Rebecca, hello.
This is hilarious. All right, I'm trying to, let me see. I'm setting up.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Wait, does it look backwards?
No, you did it right.
Okay, because right, the camera, all right. Oh.
You're good.
I have this new job, which is why I've been sort of MIA. And so we have these like cubbies, with these like talking cubbies with these like dry erase, like everything.
Oh. Hi, Scott.
Hey, hello.
How are you? Rebecca, meet Scott. Rebecca.
I can barely hear you.
How about now?
Is it maybe your computer levels? Because I actually turned up my microphone too, or the computer volume.
Is that better, Scott? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I just had to turn up my computer volume a little bit. How are you? Okay. We got Sandy coming in.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Sandy. Hi. Welcome. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay. Guys, I don't know what I just did.
All right, well, I'm going to kick this off now. So thank you all for joining us. And just to get started here, welcome. Thank you for being here and for Greenmark's latest installment of Greenmark's Growing Green. Greenmark is an award-winning media relations firm specializing in green spaces, green places, and green issues. And today we are geeking out on soil with some experts who love to talk dirty. So thank you all for joining me. And before I make the introductions, real quick, for those of you new on the Blab platform, you can certainly engage us with questions and comments, and we encourage you to do so. Questions, however, should be preceded with a /Q and a space, and that will queue up for us, and we'll know that you would like something addressed before we can conclude our chat. So, okay. With introductions, I am your host. My name is Heather Blackmore. I am a garden scout and field editor for several national and regional publications, as well as a writer, photographer, and blogger. And I'm joined by Scott Stewart, director of the Lurie Garden. Hello, Scott.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Hello. Andy Seberg, president of Purple Cow Organics in Wisconsin.
Hello, glad to be here.
Last but certainly not least, the compostess herself from New York City, Rebecca Louie, author of the recently released book, Compost City. Thank you for being here, guys.
Thank you for having us. This is going to be awesome.
Yeah. So, all right. So, Scott, I want to start with you as the director of a 5-acre garden in the heart of Chicago. What's that like overseeing such a big piece of land?
I'm sorry. I must be a little delayed on the system. Could you repeat that real quick?
Oh, sure. No, I was just wondering what it's like as the overseer of 5 acres of garden in the heart of Chicago. What's that experience like?
Intense is one word, I guess. It's an interesting environment to be being overseeing, because we serve such a broad demographic, such a broad group of interests. We have people who love architecture, people who love plants, who love native plants, who love animals, who love insects, who love all of these aspects, and we have to be all of those things. And it's intense. At the same time, it's one of the most wonderful things to be doing when you see people connecting with nature in the way that they do in the garden. It's phenomenal, wonderful.
Okay, so with 5 acres of land to oversee, when you addressed the Garden Writers meeting back in March in Chicago, you spoke about the spring mow down that you do at Lurie Garden. Can you explain that and why the purpose of that process?
Yes, our spring mow down, that's one of our most important components of our annual management of the garden. So we at Lurie Garden, we don't use any types of synthetic chemicals to control pests, to do soil fertility, to really do any of those traditional horticultural management practices in the garden. Our spring mow down is one of our primary, particularly soil management perspectives or soil management processes. So we leave our garden up year round, does wonderful things for wildlife, does wonderful things for aesthetics and design. But then in the spring, very early spring, we cut the garden down. All of that organic matter we leave in the garden, and actually that becomes the organic material that will feed our garden for the coming year. So we have been over the last several years tracking, organic matter and cation exchange capacity and all of these other soil factors, and looking at how our spring cut down, our spring mow down actually impacts that. And we've seen significant improvements in our soil fertility, significant improvements in soil health, in soil biology. We've seen incredible improvements in all of these aspects. And it really has all to do with, and it starts with that spring mow down.
Mm-hmm. So how long have you been doing that practice?
We've been doing that practice of cutting down the garden now for close to 5 years, 6 years or so. Okay. Prior to that, we would cut the garden down and some of that material would be removed, or the majority of that material, that cut material, would be removed. And then we went a few years where the garden was, because it was so young, the garden's only a decade old at this point. So because the garden was so young, there just wasn't much material left standing. So when you cut that down, by the time that was mulched up, there really wasn't much left. It was left there, but it was not nearly the quantity of material that we have now. So
okay. So is this practice something that you would suggest the home gardener do as well?
I would suggest anyone, and this is a practice that's adaptable to really anyone's garden. It works for us because we have 100% perennial plant material. We have a lot of plant material that overwinters well, so you get a lot of very good vertical growth very good vertical standing over the winter. So there's still lots of material to cut. If you have a garden, or if you have a garden space that's primarily annual plant material, there's not going to be much material left at the following spring. Works wonderfully for perennial gardens, and it even works wonderfully if all you have is a patio with a container and a few perennial plants. You can dice up that material and put that right back in that soil. So the practice is very scalable from that perspective.
So how are you gauging the success of that mow down? Are you testing the soil every year to see where you fall? Because I know you mentioned when you were talking with the garden writers, your soil pH has changed quite a bit. So do you attribute that to? Okay. All right.
Yes. Yeah. So we track a number of factors to determine the success, determine how we do the cut down, timing of the cut down. So we track soil pH. So we have a sampling grid across our entire 5-acre garden that we take annual soil samples from. Twice a year we take soil samples, usually in the spring and then again in the fall. So we do that mainly because the microorganisms that impact soil chemistry are coming back alive and out of dormancy in the spring, and they're starting to go into dormancy in the fall. And we want to look at how that is working with our organic matter and so forth. So we do that twice a year. And we're tracking things for soil organic content, soil organic matter content, pH of the soil. We're also tracking cation exchange capacity, basically nutrient ion holding capacity of the soil. We're tracking compactness of the soil. We're also tracking some other sort of somewhat more technical aspects of the soil to look at soil particulate size and so forth as that changes over time. And that all feeds back into how we manage our above ground portion of our garden so that our below ground portion is being managed appropriately as well.
Okay, so are you adding anything? I know you said you do no synthetic fertilizer. Are you adding anything to the garden yearly in addition to what you're doing, the mow down?
No.
Not at all.
No, cool. Nothing at all. Really, from its inception till today and moving forward, no fertilizers, no synthetic pest control mechanisms, nothing like that has been used in our soil. And actually, a lot of people don't realize this. They know that the whole Millennium Park Lurie Garden complex is basically a green roof. But what they don't realize is that the soil in Lurie Garden is actually native Illinois soil. So it's not a manufactured or an engineered soil. It's actually a soil that was harvested. It's floodplain soil, 60% sand roughly. And it was actually harvested from an area in central Kankakee County, brought up to the site, stored no deeper than about 1.5 to 2 feet deep to try to maintain as much biological activity, to not compact the soil and choke out all those wonderful biological organisms, and then installed into the garden in a manner in which really promoted the living nature of this native soil. So we had good soil to start with. We had living, active soil to start with, and now we've been sort of caretaking that soil. We've been helping that soil along.
Okay. All right, so Sandy, that brings me to, I know you've been traveling on the soil mobile. Last couple weeks, or how long has that been going on?
Just this last week was our first tour out to Nebraska and Iowa.
Okay, and what are you doing?
We're basically stopping at our independent garden center partners and other locations, farmers markets, food cooperatives, and sharing information about soil health, how to improve your soil health, what's happened to degrade our soils over the years, from the cultural practices, tillage, fertilizers, and even the plants themselves. Plants remove nutrients. Part of the reason why Scott's project works so well is that he's taking those nutrients that those plants have worked with their microbial partners up into those plant material and then returning it back to the plant. In our agricultural systems or in our gardens, where we take a fruit or vegetable or a grain away, we remove some of those nutrients as well. So there's ways to use organic inputs, which we're in the business of producing, to not only provide that biological inoculum that is so necessary to work to liberate those nutrients, but also to replace some of the carbon and organic matter and nutrients that have been removed in the process of growing our food.
So how did you come up with the recipes for your products to aid the soil?
Our primary business is organic conversion and composting. So we take yard materials. This is a good setup for you. But for years, we've been growing tree cities and having urban or peri-urban areas generating large amounts of organic residuals. And I grew up on a farm where it was really just hammered by my grandmother to feed the soil. Again, biomimicry is what Scott's doing at the Lurie Garden, a way to do that in either an unnatural system, which is a cultivated soil, or in an unnatural system where we don't necessarily have the commensurate amount of soil to return the leaves that fall in a city, for instance, back to that soil. We bring that back out to the country. We convert that into a soil amendment, put that back in the soil to grow food to send back into the city.
Oh, I see. Okay, and I was wondering this. How did you arrive at the name Purple Cow? Where does that come from?
It actually was inspired by a book, and the name of the book is Purple Cow, written by Seth Godin. And it really, we were looking for a name for a retail product, back in the mid-2000s. And the book really spoke about how to be called word of mouth advertising. Now it's viral marketing. But the reality is that no company can really make a product that is going to succeed with the speed of knowledge and the speed of information in today's marketplace unless it's remarkable. And Seth summed up that remarkableness in the fact that a purple cow is pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. So when you addressed our garden writers group back in March at the Chicago Flower and Garden Show, you specifically talked about, used broccoli as an example. And I was so taken aback by that. Could you talk about that? I mean, as far as how much broccoli we need to eat now to get the amount of nutrients that people were getting back in the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, it actually surprised me when I found out some of that information, and it's certainly easier to access now with the internet. But the USDA has actually been tracking the nutrients, primary nutrients, calcium being one of them, in fruits and vegetables since the year I was born, 1958. So the broccoli that was tested in 1958 has a little over 4 times, or had a little over 4 times as much calcium as broccoli did in 2008. The reason for that is that agricultural systems and the soil degradation that I was talking about, and why we have the Soil Mobile out on tour, really talking and trying to connect soil health and bring that conversation and the momentum of that conversation forward, is that, you know, farmers are not really compensated for how much calcium is in broccoli. They only get paid for how much broccoli they grow. So, you know, we as eaters need to become more ecological eaters and think about the food that we're purchasing from a broader spectrum of the nutrients it contains. And by having those nutrients in the soil, you know, that ensures that the nutrients are in our food. So calcium supplements, which have become of high importance in the past decade, and its understanding to increasing understanding of its connection to human health, is only one of 60 or so nutrients that are necessary for plants to grow. And so, you know, tying back to J.I. Rodale's healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy people is really sort of the mantra of our Soil Mobile and what we're trying to do from the standpoint of connecting soil health to human health.
Right. Yeah, it was very interesting when you spoke about that, and how the tie between the depletion of the soil and then the growth of the vitamin supplement industry, and how that took off. I never thought of that. I never realized that was the case. So I was so interested when you mentioned that. So Rebecca, can you tell us about your journey? It's interesting where you started and how you got to become a master composter.
Sure. In all honesty, I grew up in New York City, and you know, never touched a blade of grass, never looked at the worms, except like to be freaked out when it rained on the sidewalk and they were crawling around. And the first part of my career was as an entertainment journalist, so it was very different. It was like red carpets, high heels, like the whole kind of stereotypical bag. And then in my late 20s, I just had a life switch and realized, you know, that I was kind of burning out on that career. It's a little bit draining, and it sort of lacked a certain soulfulness. I always say that I was ready for it in my life. So I started cooking more, and cooking leads to all sorts of cuttings and scraps, and sort of coming from a family that's like, don't waste and save things. I was looking at these piles of peels and being like, what can I do? So I started composting independently in a worm bin in my garage, and I'd read a couple things online. I bought 1,000 worms. I stuck them in a tub. The idea is that they eat the scraps and they poop out this really beautifully microbially rich soil amendment that's like, you know, manna from heaven. But I killed them right away. Like, I read like 2 sentences on the internet. I thought I could handle it. And, it was like this worm massacre. It was stinky. It was crazy. And it was a disaster. So fortunately, New York City has a really amazing network of opportunities, both on the community level and on an actually very structured municipal level, where we have a master composter certification. It's sort of in line with the idea of a master gardener program, where, you know, it's kind of like the teachers teach the students who become the teachers, and it's this like beautiful cycle of education and community building. And so the program that we have, which is based on the program started by Seattle TILF in the 80s, is like several, I think, months long. There's a community aspect where you have X amount of hours to actually participate and bring the things that you're learning into the world, into the city, whether that's in a community garden, in a school and education space, or just maintaining bins and projects that are around the city. And I took it, and it kind of changed my life. It kind of blew my mind that myself, as this not very green gardener, like I had no background in this. I had very little access to the kinds of spaces that maybe like, Scott has like 5 acres in the middle of this. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. But suddenly I realized there were all these small space opportunities for me to compost in my tiny Queens apartment. There are ways I could collaborate with neighbors or community gardens or schools or whoever, workplaces even, to kind of corral our scraps and then bring them to someone else who needed them. And then maybe they collected 10, 15, 20 bags of leaves from a park fall cleanup, and rather than have them go to the landfill, kind of bring it all together in these different ways to basically transform what was previously conceived of as waste product into the potential to make like amazing soil for gardens and plants.
Mm-hmm. So have you seen, since you started doing this, have you seen an increase in New York City and people that are interested in composting, and they're composting in their tiny apartments?
Yeah. It's a huge movement right now, both on the small scale and the large scale. So there have been some pilot programs that have actually been rolled out by the Department of Sanitation where they have brown bins. So sort of in the vein of like, Seattle, San Francisco. They're beginning to see what it looks like when homes are actually separating their organics, which in this case would include like meat and dairy and cooked food, for pickup through the sanitation department to like bring off somewhere else. So there's a few neighborhoods participating in that. Actually, so in my book, I wrote this book, Compost City. I interviewed these moms on the Upper West Side of Manhattan who were part of a green PTA kind of group. And they thought, well, we have these composting trays in our cafeteria, but we don't actually compost the food. So they did a pilot and they just went for it. They created a system by which the students were learning how to compost, to separate in the cafeteria. They partnered with a waste hauler to see what the cost would be to, take trucks and trucks of this away. And it was and they created like soil, what were they called? Trash troopers. And they had songs and monitors, and it was very like empowering for the kids. And they created a successful pilot study that when, compiled in terms of metrics and ease and sort of how it was implemented, became a boilerplate that the Department of Sanitation also embraced. So now there are all these schools, like hundreds of schools participating in a community composting effort. And in terms of the individuals, yes, like everyone's into it. We have all these parks in the city, and it's a very elaborate food scrap drop-off program in green markets where there are farmers markets and people bring like frozen bags of their food scraps to the markets to drop off to be composted by various groups in the city. But then you have individuals doing worm bins. It's really big. Kids love it. You have people doing bokashi, which is a fermentation of food waste in a bucket, in like a tight airtight bucket that's then buried in soil to decompose. So these small solutions can fit and scale up to any size community or waste stream in a city space.
So for someone who's just starting out and wants to start composting, what's the simplest thing they can do to put themselves on that path to growing good soil?
Sure. Well, if you have access to outdoor space, because sometimes you do in a city, and then if you have the luxury of being in the suburbs or in rural areas, I would start with either digging a big hole and putting your peels, your scraps from fruits and vegetables, no meat or dairy, but just kind of like a banana peel, and toss it in that hole and cover it up with soil. What will happen is that the microbes and the worms and the other small critters in the soil that are there are going to do what they were meant to do, which is chew it up, poop it out, and like create this beautiful ecosystem in the soil. It's really low level, right? Engagement. And if you do one peel a week, now this is like the inspirational Oprah moment. Like if everyone did like one peel a week across the United States, like that is literally bananas. Like it would divert a ton. So you could start there. But then let's say you want to evolve that concept. There's this idea of a digester where it's literally sort of like a contained, think of like a garbage can half immersed in the soil. And the bottom half of it has holes drilled into it. Maybe there's no bottom. And you lift the lid and you start putting a little bit more in, right? And because it's underground, it's kind of a direct path for all those creatures to come right up, chew it up, poop it out, and spread it around. If you're in an indoor space, worms are a really fun, great family experience, like whatever individual experience. I was like staring into my worm bin myself. But worms are really interesting because you kind of this pet mentality, and that's a different level of engagement. There's some tricks to taking care of worms, but they're in a contained space. They're not like roaming free. They're in a storage tote, or you can buy commercial worm bins. There's like stacked systems. It's like whatever floats your boat. but they're really fun. And what they produce, because it's so microbially rich, having passed through a worm's, little intestinal tract, it can go a lot further. So like, you get a tablespoon, but to top dress your plant with that is actually super powerful. And my final suggestion, to start would be a bokashi bucket, because the fermentation process actually is very forgiving. So you can actually do meat, you can do cooked foods, you can like clean out your fridge from all the weird leftovers that you have, and you're piling it in a bucket, which is closed. And again, you can pick the size, so it's whatever fits for you. And eventually it just sits there. It's very passive. It ferments over a few weeks. And then I guess the kicker is you have to have some place to bury it. But you partner with a community garden if you don't have a yard or whatever, and you dig a big hole, you bury it, and you just forget and walk away. These are all pretty low barriers. It's not like the sweating and the turning and the pitchforks and all that.
And I think that appeals to a lot of people too, because I think we want biggest bang for our buck with as little work as possible. So that might be the way to do that. So Sandy, as far as your products, you work with gardeners and farmers. What's the reception been like? I mean, how are these products that they need to have their soil tested before applying, or is this a general use thing that they can spread out to benefit the soil?
It's a general use product that improves the health of soil and delivers those microorganisms and the organic matter. So it really has sort of a physical, immediate impact change. If they have heavy clay soils, let's break it up. If they have light sandy soils, the magic of compost, helps it hold more water. So it has all of those, environmental regulating components to it and nutrient liberating components. If it comes into a situation where a gardener or a farmer is ever seeking either optimum results or challenges with the results that they're having, I mean, I always do recommend a soil test, as a basis for that. And certainly if they're in a situation where it's year after year and there's some expectations and financial requirements about, inputs and results, a soil test, helps build a roadmap as to what's working and what directions you need to go. And it also helps in that crop removal aspect I was talking about earlier, so that if you do get a bumper crop, whether it's your garden or a multiple acre farm field, as my grandmother always said, you got to feed soil, so there's a little payback. And whether it's homemade compost that Rebecca was talking about, or larger scale material that's produced according to organic standards, that's a product that helps return, once soils are even operating optimally, it helps return and sort of repair and add resilience to a soil. So, when it has to be turned over, it has to be cultivated, or it has to potentially be harvested when it's wet, all of those things don't happen in a natural soil plant system. So, adding back organic material in the form of compost in particular, helps regulate that and add resilience back to a full, to maintain a soil in a full functioning way.
Now, do you ever conduct tests where, I'm sure you probably have, but where a farmer or gardener has applied your product to the soil and then followed up the following year to gauge through some sort of measurement how the soil has improved?
Yeah, I mean, we've had certainly numerous anecdotal results where people, have been growing, six tomato plants, for years, and they've used, Purple Cow, and the yield is increased, so they're only going to, plant 3 tomato plants. And certainly taking that fully over to the other side, where we run a research farm in conjunction with our operation, where we've tracked, over multiple years, periods of time, where by adding biology and compost and actually, feeding the soil and treating the soil, that we've seen nutrient levels increase on soil tests higher than the amount of nutrients that were applied. So that's where, we have true independent lab results that show that we're actually liberating nutrients that are in the soil, and bringing those nutrients into a plant available form. And that's tremendous, when we're talking about limited resources of certain nutrients that are mined nutrients, that need to go back into soil environments, figuring out ways to maximize how efficient they are from the standpoint of being transformed into a plant available form, or even better yet, needing to use less or maybe none of them in order to get the same plant productivity.
Sure. Okay. Now, Scott, I was thinking about something that just triggered a thought. When you're in the garden, is there anything, a specific plant that wasn't planted intentionally that would be growing in the garden that might be indicative of something happening in the soil, that, a plant that you wouldn't want there, that would be kind of telling?
Absolutely. And that's actually through the year. So in addition to those soil tests I was mentioning earlier, those are kind of beginning endpoints for us. Throughout the year, my staff and I, we're in the garden every day. We actually have identified sort of indicator species, more or less, indicator plants that we keep a regular eye on, and that we're taking some form of measurement. Some of it's anecdotal right now, some of it's observational, but we're moving toward actually being able to take more accurate measurements of plants from a color perspective, from a bloom time perspective, from overall size, overall structure, and to be able to relate those back to soil health. And so throughout the year, we've got a number of plants that we keep a pretty close eye on to sort of tell us maybe what's going on in throughout the growing season. Salvia is a good example. So Lurie Garden is famous for its Salvia River. Blooms hopefully every June. We'll see this June. We're a little off cycle with things, but that Salvia River, it's 5 different cultivars of salvia. We know that how it should respond given our current soil, our current moisture availability, our current soil temperature and air temperature. We know how that plant should respond. So when we see something a little different, leaf color change, for example, or we see delay in flowering in one of those cultivars, one of the things that we do is we rule out soil temperature, air temperature, extra moisture, not enough moisture, and then we're usually left with maybe there's something going on with the soil. And that gives us some clues to further inform the soil test results. We do the same with several other plants throughout the garden that we have that are more or less indicator species for us. And actually, we've already talked about tomatoes are actually actually that's like the textbook example for the home sort of vegetable grower or garden grower. You look up soils and vegetables in just about any textbook or any soils biology guide, and it always has the example of the color changes of a tomato leaf, and that's what's going on in the soil. That's for someone at home, that's a perfect plant to find a spot in your garden to throw a couple of those in. And that gives you a decent gauge of what maybe is going on in your soil. It's a really somewhat crude, but it's also a clever little way to keep an eye on what's going on with your soil chemistry.
Oh, that's interesting. So, Rebecca, I was checking out your website, compostist.com, and I noticed you offer, on your services, you offer compost parties. And I thought that for birthdays, what's the reception been like? I mean, do you have a large group of children that are interested in composting parties?
So the idea, right, is that rather than like the creepy clown that skulks around the children, it's like, come, bring some worms, take home worm bins, learn about the life cycle, and then give sheets to the parents, because that's really who's going to take care of them in the end. So I've done some really great programs, more so with school groups than with like children's birthdays. And it's really great, again, getting back to the idea of curriculum, because not only are you talking about sustainability and life cycles and waste, but you have pets and there's responsibility. And look, I found a cocoon and worm babies. Like the whole spectrum of learning is actually really broad. I mean, we're talking about food, we're talking about community, we're talking about soil, agriculture. It goes on forever. So I found that school groups have been resonating the most with the idea of a little like in-class compost party. And again, worms are going to kill it every time. Like you'll win over a crowd with a worm.
So you don't get a whole lot of ew and oh no. Are they really interested?
So that's the funny thing. I mean, I really believe in that whole, the children are their future thing.
Right.
And I hear a lot of adults talking about how their children are learning about sustainability practices in school, and they come home and sort of monitor mom and dad. They're like, that's recyclable, and we have worms, and you should compost. And, their minds are a little bit more flexible. I mean, we learn the ew, right? Like we learn what's uncomfortable with us, and kids are kind of open to everything. So what I like also about composting, and this is sort of one of those qualitative aspects as an individual home composter, but you get over yourself, right? You're kind of opening and becoming more in touch with a larger organic process of the world, where especially in a city where your food's delivered, like you can get anything delivered and it just shows up and it's magical. You kind of forget there's a real world where all these things came from.
Sure.
And kids have that to start. So
yeah, as I was researching for this, have any of you had the opportunity to watch the documentary Symphony of the Soil?
Yes.
Oh, I was blown away by it, and it was very enlightening. And one of their researchers made the remark that what's going on in the soil is the equivalent of New Year's Eve in Times Square all the time. And I thought that's incredible that there's so much activity. And I never thought of it that way, that I think that she said 70 to 80% of the organisms within soil have yet to be identified. It's that active. It's interesting information.
But by constantly taking from it, we are not replenishing that community. Like, what would Times Square be without all the bottles of booze and the burgers and the things that those people eat all day to survive that cold night, And so I think what we're all trying to do is encourage returning back to the land, the things that we're just bagging up and sticking in the landfills.
Definitely. All right, guys. Well, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think would be important to include before we wrap this up? Yeah. All right. Well, just to let everybody know who's watching, our Green Mark Growing Green Blab runs the third Thursday of every month. So we'll be coming on again. Let's see, I've got May 19th at noon, and we'll be talking about growing your garden and eating it too. So I'll have some experts on to share some tips and tricks to get you guys growing and eating well. And the link to this blab will live on Greenmark PR's website. So it's greenmarkpr.com, as well as the blog that I will be completing. It'll be up and running alongside of it tomorrow on the website, on the link on Greenmark PR, Growing Green. So with that, guys, thank you all for participating. I really appreciate you taking time to appear on Greenmark's Growing Green.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. All right, I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much and have a great day.
You too.
Wow.